All right, we're going to start out by hitting some of the highlights of what we talked about last week. Some of the most salient points in our discussion of the way client and server scripting works. And we're going to focus on the client side because we get to the server side stuff later on, right around the midpoint of the semester. So, put a Word document here. Let's review the most important parts of client-side scripting. And client-side scripting means JavaScript. All right. In the case of server-side scripting, which we also discussed last week, there can be any number of platforms that it can be done on. It can be done on PHP. It can be done using Java servlet pages. It can be done using Java servlets. It can be done using Python. It can be done using ASP.NET. But on the client side, there's really only one game in town, and that is JavaScript. So if we're going to do an overview of client-side scripting, I'm going to start out first of all, say that JavaScript is the language for client side. Yeah, and on the server side, you have some choices. On the client side, it's JavaScript. JavaScript code is delivered by the server as part of the server's response to an HTTP request. So you request a web page. How do you request a web page from a server? You could type in the URL. That'd be one way. Another way would be clicking on a link, right? That'd be probably the two ways that I can think of off the top of my head. There probably are others too, but it's a long weekend, and I won't test myself trying to remember other ways that you could access or make a request to the server. But it's sent as part of the server's response to HTTP request. JavaScript is actually executed by the browser. So the web browser has, among its ability to display HTML code and to render CSS code and such, it has the ability to execute the client-side JavaScript code that comes across. JavaScript works on a loaded web page. That code executes in the browser. The browser has a loaded page. That is a page that was sent over by the server. JavaScript works on web pages that's been loaded within the browser, right? JavaScript alters the web page. And there's other things that JavaScript could do as well, but it alters the web page by changing the HTML CSS for the page. And finally, JavaScript is triggered by some event. The event might be the user clicks a button, puts their mouse over a link, types of key, any number of things can be triggering JavaScript code to run. Right. Now this is, we'll go over an example that I believe we went over in CISS 230 or 216 last year, but I believe we extend it a little bit. I feel it too. All right. This is my silly little Star Wars spoiler where we have several buttons that trigger events. Now on this page, the events that's going to trigger, the events that trigger the JavaScript to execute are the buttons. And we have several buttons here. We can show a spoiler. So Luke Skywalker's dad is Yoda. Spoiler, you can hide it. We have a toggle spoiler here. And what do I mean by toggle? I mean it will show it if it's hidden. It will hide it if it's shown. Okay, so right now the spoiler is hidden. So if I press toggle spoiler, it will show it. If I press, now that it's being displayed, if I press it, it can hide the spoiler. Now, one thing we could do, and depending on time, we may get to this, is I could actually change the text on this button so that when the spoiler is not being shown, it will say show spoiler. And when the spoiler is being shown, the button will say hide spoiler. That would be a cool thing to do. We could change the appearance of the button. And these work the same way. All right. Let's look at this and let's keep in mind all the things that I talked about when we described what JavaScript does. Right. First of all, JavaScript code is part of the web page, got sent over from our server. In this case, we really don't have a server, but it got loaded when the web page was open. And it works hand in hand with the HTML and the JavaScript, and the CSS, I mean. So for example, I have a class of spoiler here that has a display of none. And then I have the number of things in here, a number of paragraphs that have the class of spoiler. That way, with one CSS rule, I can hide all of these at once. Because this paragraph here is a class of spoiler. This paragraph also has a class of spoiler, as does this paragraph. So when the page initially loads, this style rule takes effect and it hides all of them. It makes the display none. So not only does it not show, it doesn't take up any space on the page. We have our button here, and we'll look at the first one first. Notice that we don't have our JavaScript code right as part of the button. Okay? Our JavaScript code as part of the button calls a function. Why do we do that? We do that for a number of reasons. First of all, these examples that we're doing are fairly straightforward. There are only a couple of instructions. But in other cases, there could be a whole bunch of stuff that happens when the user clicks a button or hovers their mouse over a link or whatever. And therefore, we want to group all those instructions together into a unit. And then we want to execute that unit. And we might want to execute it from different parts on the page. So for example, I have show spoiler here. I have show spoiler here. I have show spoiler here. All of these call the show spoiler function, which does two things. It displays something. It sets the display property to black, and it sets the color to blue, the text. Notice then when we call this function, we give it a different argument each time. In this case, when we click the button, show spoiler passes an argument of spoiler 1. That is the ID of the thing that we want to show. Here, when we do it, we want to show spoiler 2. So we say, we pass the argument spoiler 2, which again is the ID of spoiler we want to show. Same thing with this. Now remember, a class can relate to multiple elements on the page. So multiple things on the page can have a class of spoiler. However, each ID has to be unique. So that's why I have to call it spoiler 1, spoiler 2, and spoiler 3, because each ID has to be unique, right? So this is called the argument of the function. And the argument of the function says, what do we want to apply the function to? So we have a function. We took all our code that we want to do when we show a spoiler. We wrapped it into a function. How do you define a function? Well, you can define a script tag with the word function, the name of the function, give any arguments to the function. Arguments of the function of the function are what we're going to perform the operation on. So what spoiler are we going to show? If we had a function to add two numbers, the arguments would be the first number and the second number, because those are the two numbers we want to add, right? If we had a function to calculate tuition here at Lorraine Community College, in order to calculate tuition, you need to know the number of credit hours a student takes, and are they in county, out of county, or out of state. So in that case, there'd be two arguments: the number of credit hours and their residency status. So in this case, in order to show a spoiler, what do we need to do? Well, we need to say which spoiler we want to show. And therefore, we give this an argument of ID spoiler. Notice ID spoiler is not enclosed in quotation marks. That's because it's a variable. All right, it's an argument, which is a variable, which means that we're going to use the value of that variable whenever we do what we're going to do to it. Notice when I call the function, this argument is enclosed in quotes. Why is that? Because this is what's called a literal. There's not a variable called spoiler 1. The ID that we want to hide is literally this word, spoiler 1. Therefore, it's not the value of some variable called spoiler 1. It is actually the word spoiler 1. It's literally that. So we put them in quotation marks. Notice also the use of quotation marks here. Use double quotation marks to indicate the start and end of the JavaScript statement. We use single quotation marks to designate the beginning and end of this literal. It's really important to do that, because if we use a double quotation mark here, then browser would assume that that was the end of the JavaScript statement. All right, because the JavaScript statement starts with this quotation mark. If we use the double quotes here, all right, JavaScript's going to think that's the end of the statement, and it doesn't know what to do with it. And if we use Visual Studio Code, it actually shows that as an error message saying, hey, something's wrong. We ended the JavaScript statement, we didn't close the parentheses. So it displays an error. And the browser would show a similar error. So we use single quotes inside the double quotes to designate a literal value. So what happens when we call this function? When we call this function, these statements get executed. All the statements defined in the function get executed. Other thing that happens is this value gets put into this variable, which means that the instructions inside this function can use that variable as a value of the thing that we want to show. So when we click on the button, that starts the ball rolling. This event occurs, the on-click event occurs. We're going to call the function called showSpoiler, and we're going to put the letters for spoiler one, literally the word spoiler one, we're going to put that in the variable called ID spoiler. Anytime within the function that we refer to ID spoiler, we mean whatever we call the function with. So for the first button, that's going to be spoiler one. For the second one, it's going to be spoiler two. For the third one, spoiler three. All right, so let's look at these statements one at a time, because these statements then execute. First thing it does is it finds a thing on the page that has the ID that's contained in the variable ID spoiler. If we click this button, thing on the page with an ID of ID spoiler, in this case, spoiler one, is this paragraph here. We want to change something about it. What do we want to change about it? We want to change its style. What about the style we want to change? We want to change the display property of the style to black. So what that does is that actually goes in and changes this value that we set with the class. It changed the value only for this ID. It changes it to black, and that makes it appear. And we also change the color of the text to blue. Now that's kind of hard to see. I'm going to temporarily change this to black so that we can see that it actually does change the color. So now, spoilers show up in red. When we click show spoiler, it makes the spoiler blue. I just did that to show that there's more than one instruction that we can do in a function. I want to do that. I'll leave it at that. Now, does anyone have any questions about this part of it so far? Main thing we're doing different in this case that we've done in other cases is that we're actually calling a function to do that instead of having the code to directly as part of the event. Now, what's the difference when we click the second button? The difference is when we call the function, we pass the function the value of spoiler 2. And what does that do for us? Well, then ID spoiler in this function will now have the value of spoiler 2. And will display and hide thing, the thing that has an ID of spoiler 2. Refresh it. We can show spoiler 1, we can hide spoiler 1. Because the hide function works the same way, except all it does is it sets the value of the argument to none. So it kind of reverses this. So we pass the same argument, but we pass the ID of the thing that we want to hide. It gets put in the value of ID spoiler, and then we find a thing on the page that has the ID of ID spoiler, and we set the display of none. We click on this, we hide spoiler 1. What do you suppose happens if we click hide spoiler and it's already hidden? Nothing. It's still hidden. The code actually goes and sets the value to none, but since it was already none, there's no visual impact on the page. Same thing with these. Now, here's the cool thing. Now that we have this code in the function, we can easily duplicate it. We can easily duplicate it in several places just by changing the argument. So what's the most fun class at CCC? And of course, it's this class, CISS232. Only thing I have to do is give it its own ID, change the function so that when it calls it, it will pass that ID as an argument. So with minimal changes, I've added and I've enhanced the page. Your goal as a software developer is to make your code easy to change, because you know that change is going to be inevitable. I mean, even if this is a philosophy class, you'd be studying that change is inevitable, right? But in terms of web pages, there's always something that's going to be changed about the page. There's always going to be something added, something rearranged, whatever. So your goal as a software developer is to make code that is easy to change. And in our case, by putting the code in functions, we made it real easy to add another thing to our list of spoilers. Right? So we made that easier to change. if you have two solutions, if you have two ways of doing something, and one way would require a lot of work, make a change to the page to, for example, in this case, to add an extra spoiler. If one solution had a lot of work and another solution only had a little bit of work, the one with a little bit of work is probably the better solution because that's more easy to maintain. All right, now last but not least, we're going to look at that toggle spoiler button. That toggle spoiler button also passes the argument, the ID that we want to the ID of the spoiler that we want to toggle. It has an if statement in this. What is an if statement? An if statement is sometimes called a branching statement because there's two courses, there's two paths that the code can follow. One path if the if statement is true, another path if the if statement is false. So in this case, if statement looks at display property of the spoiler corresponding to the button we clicked on. And if it's equal to none, or if it's equal to nothing, what the two vertical lines means, these are usually called a pipe. So if this is true or this is true, then we're going to set this to display property to block. Otherwise, we set the display property to none. Now, the way the if statement works is we have a condition that's enclosed in parentheses. We then have a set of curly braces, the true part of the if statement, and a set of braces optionally for the false part of the statement. Code like this is critical to align properly. So the if should align with this curly brace, the else should align with it, and so should this curly brace. I usually put the curly brace after the end of the if condition. So we have two paths that you can take. True path or the false path. Now, what might seem a little confusing is this. And I'm going to cut this code out for a second. And we're going to debug because if I cut this code out, it's not going to work. Cut that code out. Notice something specific. It doesn't work the first time. Then it starts working. All right, that's a tricky one, right? Why would it work subsequent times, but not the first time? Well, again, there's a lot of things you could do to solve this. You could, a lot of times people simply stare at the code and hope that something jumps out at them. It's best to take a more systematic approach. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at how we can debug this. And a very useful statement in debugging is the console log statement. So for example, I'm going to put console log ID spoiler. In fact, I'm going to add to that and say ID equals. I'm going to add to that ID spoiler. All this is doing is it's concatenating those two things together. ID equals is going to put exactly as that because that's a literal. It's enclosed in quotes. So we're going to get the character ID equals on our console. Then we're going to get the value of that variable. So let's save it. Click that. And let's view our console. How do we view our console? On Google Chrome, you click these three buttons. For tools, developer tools, and you select console. There you see that message, ID equals spoiler 1. Well, that's what it's supposed to be, right? So we know that part is right. Well, I'm going to take the long path in figuring this out. Maybe something's wrong with that if statement. So I'm going to put a message here. So is there an error in that if statement that's not executing it? Be one possibility. We'll look at that in a second. ID equals spoiler 1. If statement is false. So we now know that it's going and it's following this path in the code. Well, let's display value of display property before the if statement. I'm going to display the display property. Display property equals, see anything. Now, you might think, well, should it be none? I think that that's a reasonable thought because the style rule says for everything that's a spoiler, make the display equals none. But that's defined on the class level. There's no display set on the ID level. That's on the class level. So I can easily fix that by saying or that's equals empty string. be sure it's an empty string, you could put like asterisks around it. So now when we run this, tells us that the display property equals two asterisks right next to each other. But our if statement we corrected, so it puts it back. We can look at this code and see things are the way we expect from here on in. It's only that first time that we got into trouble. The specific problem that we ran into is less important than my discussion of taking a systematic approach to debugging this. And the console log is a good way to get right into your code and see what instructions are being executed and see what values different variables take. Because if things aren't working the way that you thought they should, I mean, maybe the variables don't have the values that you think they have. Maybe the instructions you think are executed aren't being executed. I, generally speaking, would either move or comment out the console logs after I've debugged the problem. Just to not clutter the console with stuff. What if we had a problem in the code? One thing I didn't mention about JavaScript before is it's case sensitive. So that capital D is not correct. It should be displayed with a lowercase d. What will we see in the console then? Both of these things. Interestingly enough, it's not giving me an error. How would I figure that out? Well, go back and I'd put my console logs to see, is that if statement true or false? If statement is true. If statement is true, really interesting, giving me an error. The statement is false. It keeps showing up as false. Then you could look at it and figure out what's wrong with the if statement, and hopefully you'd figure out that. D. Other cases where you have an error, if you, for example, forgot the quote, give you the error, but will give it to you in sort of vague terms. In this case, invalid or unexpected token. Right, that is that's a confusing one because it tells you the error is in line 23, column 68. And if we look over, it's actually the quote is at 68. And what it means is we don't have a quote to close it. So unexpected token means it ran into something that it didn't expect to see. So you're likely to have something extra or something missing in, probably something missing. Now, let me talk about your assignment this week. Your assignment, not your assignment that's due this Wednesday, but your assignment that's due a week from this Wednesday. Your first lab was to create a web page that had 4 sections. My remembering is right, JavaScript, PHP, Ajax. So you'll have something that looks like this, my page with JavaScript, PHP, and Ajax. It only needs to have HTML and CSS. Make it look professional, so don't just turn in something really bare bones. I know some of my examples are bare bones, but that's because I'm illustrating something specific. But it should be formatted to look good, complete, and professional. Now that's lab 1. For lab 2, you're going to take the same content. You're going to set it up this way. On your page, you're going to have 3 tabs. One for JavaScript, one for PHP, one for Ajax. When the page first displays, you should display the section of code about Ajax. I'm sorry, not Ajax, JavaScript. If I click on another tab, it should show that content and get rid of the old content. So if I click on PHP, it gets rid of JavaScript and displays the content relating to PHP. Likewise with Ajax. So let's think about what we've learned so far that will help us with this, right? Well, first of all, we've shown how to display and to hide things, okay? So that could come in very useful here. You're going to have a page that has 3 sections, just like it had before. So your HTML is going to be very similar to what it was for lab 1. The difference being is you're going to put these tabs on, which could be just links, or they could be buttons, or you could do it a number of different ways. And when the user clicks on them, you're going to hide some of the things and display the one that was clicked on. So for example, if you click on JavaScript, it's going to hide PHP and Ajax and display JavaScript. Click on PHP, it's going to hide JavaScript and Ajax and display PHP. Now here's a hint. You can make this a little bit easier if you just, anytime the user clicks one of the tabs, hide all 3 of them and then display the one that you want to display. So if I click on Ajax, I'll hide JavaScript, PHP, and Ajax, and then I'll display Ajax. And if your CSS is done correctly, then these things will be all in the same part on the screen. If you simply make them with, sort of like I did in this case with the display of none, so that if they're not being displayed, they don't take up any space on the screen. So this is truly a case of the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript working together. The HTML is the content. CSS puts things so that they line up right on top of each other, and then the JavaScript controls which one we're seeing at any given time. You might not think so, but if you reflect upon it, we've covered enough for you to do this assignment just in class. Now, sometimes people go out on the web and find other ways to do it, and that's fine. All right. But I would suggest trying to do it using just the instructions that we've covered so far and what you know about CSS and HTML. Are there any questions? Okay, that's all I had today. We will either see you in lab or we will see you next week.